Regardless of what people think about this final entry in this film series, I wanted to take a moment to address that it's the end of an era, the end of a movie series lasting almost 2 decades and spanning across 12 installments. So, to everyone involved with this franchise, whether it is the cast in front of the camera or the filmmakers behind it, I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you, not just for igniting and continuing the craze for the modern superhero and comic book genre, but also for making us all feel mutant and proud. Thank you. What is up, everybody? RandomRandomMan here, bringing you my review for Dark Phoenix. Based on the Marvel Comics X-Men characters, the plot of this superhero film basically follows the X-Men as they must face off against the full power of the Phoenix, who has taken over Jean Grey, played by Sophie Turner, after a mission in space goes wrong. Going into this movie, I honestly did not know what to expect. To quickly run down my history with the X-Men franchise as a whole, I would say that I am a fan of it for the most part. I haven't been with this series since the very beginning in 2000, like a lot of diehard fans have been, but I would say that even when I got first oriented with the series back in 2014, 5 years ago, with the imminent release of Days of Future Past, I quickly got into the appeal and hype as to what makes these characters so enjoyable and relatable in the first place. I will admit that it isn't one for the way of consistency, not necessarily quality-wise, but also just with the continuity with the entire timeline and how these movies segue into one another. So that was one reason that did make me somewhat trepidatious to go into Dark Phoenix, as this is the second time that title storyline is being adapted into a movie after 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand. As I also mentioned and so greatly emphasized with the intro of this video, this is the final installment in the core X-Men film series. Yes, the New Mutants is coming out sometime in the near future, I'm assuming, after being delayed approximately 3 million times. But yes, Dark Phoenix is supposedly the final entry in this series after Disney acquired Fox and all of its other properties with that deal earlier this year. And like I said, I was somewhat skeptical going into this film because it was redoing a storyline that wasn't done so well the first time it was adapted for the silver screen. But that also meant that it could have been improved upon if done again, though to add more senses of negativity that were surrounding this movie before release, early test screenings of this film weren't so hot. The production of this movie, I also heard, was also flawed, involving reshoots after those disastrous test screenings, and this film is also helmed by a new director. This film is directed by Simon Kinberg, who has been a longtime producer and writer for the X-Men film series, and this is his feature directorial debut, which did get me a bit nervous. With all of that being said, as a whole, I just wanted a somewhat good or somewhat satisfying end to this franchise. Well, starting out with the cast and their performances, we have a huge ensemble of players. That's what I've always loved about these movies, is that a bunch of A-list talent has always been brought together for these films, and especially after First Class and the cast going forward from that film, that's when I got more immersed into this franchise. So we have a bunch of returning players such as James McAvoy as Professor X, Michael Fassbender as Magneto, my girl Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique, Nicholas Hoult as Beast, Sophie Turner as Jean Grey / Phoenix now. And speaking of her specifically, I think that she is among some of the best performers in this film. Sophie Turner, I've never thought that she was the greatest of actresses, even when on Game of Thrones, though she did significantly grow as that series did progress. But here, I do think she gives among her best performances that I've seen in anything she has acted in before. She really sold me on the emotion and turmoil she was having internally with this phoenix taking over her on the inside, while also displaying some really destructive powers here. And then the other standout performer here, I would say, is James McAvoy as Professor X, as I've always thought that he was perfect for the role in not just channeling Patrick Stewart in his older portrayal of the character, but also in having such a patriarchal and fatherly instinct about him, and always caring about the greater good of not just the mutants, but also humanity as a whole. And then the rest of the cast here, you know, I've mostly enjoyed them as well. Ty Sheridan as Cyclops, Alexandra Shipp as Storm, Cody Smith-McPhee as Nightcrawler, Evan Peters as Quicksilver. As a whole, I think the movie is admirably acted by most of the ensemble, with the standouts to me being James McAvoy and Sophie Turner, even with the rest of the ensemble having disparaging amounts of screen time across all of them, which does go directly into the writing and directing of the film, which I'll get into now, as this movie isn't just directed by Simon Kinberg, but it's also written by him. And as I mentioned before, this is the second attempt at adapting the Dark Phoenix storyline to the silver screen, and what this film did was set itself up to be about Jean Grey / the Phoenix. That's exactly how this movie begins, as we see at first a flashback to young Jean Grey with her parents all getting involved in a car accident, Professor X then taking Grey under his wing and bringing her to his school for gifted students / mutants, and then we jump forward into the timeline in the then present day of 1992, and we see them tackle this space mission, which does have some consequences for Jean Grey specifically, and that's what permeates throughout the rest of the film. I will say that on a writing standpoint for what this movie does in its narrative, it is more cohesive than X-Men The Last Stand in what it was trying to do with its story before, as there weren't all those unneeded subplots with The Last Stand here, even though what this movie does with its narrative doesn't really go fully into what it was trying to display with its themes and messages, as again, with the core X-Men that it was focusing on, Jean Grey, there was a lot of conflict within her. And that's what a lot of the shining moments of the movie did focus on. Sophie Turner as a performer and Jean Grey as a character, her struggling with all of these powers that were hinted at in X-Men Apocalypse, where she was first introduced. But as intriguing as those aspects were, and as finely executed I thought the first act was with its space rescue mission, what this movie doesn't improve on compared to The Last Stand is with its flow as a narrative overall. I did mention before that it is more focused on the Dark Phoenix storyline compared to that third X-Men film, but what this movie does worse is become extremely rushed, no pun intended, and inconsequential by the end. The way it just all moved in total, it felt like this movie was going on fast forward, and we really didn't get that much development anyway, despite all of the glimmering glimpses of development that we saw, not just within Jean Grey, but then the other characters as well that we have seen. Frankly, the movie just thrusts us into things very quickly, and for any other movie like this one, that would be a very good thing, as we would get the action and all-around conflict running to a very immediate extent. But with Dark Phoenix and what it does, it just glosses over a lot of things, and it doesn't get us immersed into the characters, and even with their emotional moments, save for some of what Jean Grey does display. So when we do see Jean Grey in the inner struggle that she is dealing with, and then turning on the rest of the X-Men, as we do expect with the storyline that this is trying to tell, it doesn't create for that much of a pull. And without giving anything away, unless you have seen one of the trailers for this film or watched Jimmy Kimmel a few nights ago, when a major character does end up getting killed, I didn't feel that much for this character. Speaking of the other characters too, it felt like a lot of them didn't need to be there for the sake of the plot, as it was already going in such a fast pace that throwing in other characters that would later be introduced or taken out eventually, it felt all the more perplexing, to say the least. This is what the biggest issue of the movie lies with its writing and directing by Kinberg, as one could tell that this is the first time a person like him is helming a movie like this behind the camera. And it didn't feel like he understood the sense of what these characters meant, not just to fans as a whole, but how they fit and the overall, now jumbled beyond belief, timeline that this series has been working with for almost 2 decades now. I haven't even mentioned the villainous character played by Jessica Chastain yet, which only adds on more to the problems with how this movie worked as a narrative. And Jessica Chastain in this movie, I love her as an actress overall. I think she is one of the best working in Hollywood today. But I thought that she was wasted in this role that could have been a lot juicier than it was, but her performance was awful. The integration of her character really didn't work in making more conflict, not just for Jean Grey, but in expanding the X-Men universe further, even though this is the final installment. It just created more convoluted nature with this film, and I thought the best part that Chastain brought to this movie was her going around looking as sexy as she is, with her platinum blonde hair, her black outfit, and stiletto heels and stuff. Setting aside how messy this movie is as a narrative, in terms of technical merits, this movie is here and there with that as well, as there are a lot of good elements with this movie visually. I think the overall look of this movie did look pretty standard in terms of an X-Men film and in the comic book / superhero genre as a whole. It mainly had to do with this movie feeling small in scale, which for a movie like this that is intended to be the finale of this long-running franchise, that is not a good thing, because it didn't feel like this movie had any bigger stakes than it already was trying to present us with. Hence going back to my inconsequential point. But I did think some of the visuals looked eye-catching, like the alien energy or aura that eventually got into Jean Grey during the first act of this movie within the space rescue mission. I thought that looked pretty cool. And when the mutants were actually using their powers whenever we got to see them, they all looked very creative, a lot of variety with them, given how they all have different sets of powers. Speaking of that too, in terms of the editing, I already mentioned how this movie a lot of the time did feel like it was going on fast forward, but that wasn't just with the pacing, it's the way how some of the powers and action sequences are edited together. For example, with Quicksilver, though we don't get a scene as epic as in Days of Future Past or Apocalypse, when we see his powers getting used, it's like he's being done on fast forward too, but in a really weirdly edited way. It reminded me of how some of the sequences of the recent live-action Disney remake of Aladdin were edited together. That aspect of the editing and the rest of it as a whole did perplex me, as this movie is strung together by Lee Smith, who won the Oscar for Best Film Editing last year for Dunkirk. And speaking of other Oscar winners who have worked with Christopher Nolan who are on this film, the movie's original score is done by Hans Zimmer, which I immediately knew it wasn't done by John Ottman upon first hearing the music for this film. And the music did stick out to me in this film, as Hans Zimmer, I think he can rarely do any wrong, as the score that he did compose for Dark Phoenix did add on to some of the energy that it was trying to display, but also in making it feel darker in tone, as the title not just implied, but also with the way the story played out. I actually think it's one of Hans Zimmer's more standout superhero film scores that he has done, and I thought it kicked into high gear when the third act of this film did hit with the train sequence, and that has been one of the parts of this movie that has been highly publicized as being reshot, which I did find out weeks ago. And yeah, when you do watch that part of the movie, it does feel different compared to the rest of it. For one thing, the way it flowed and had its energy together, it did feel quite in contrast to what was already done with the first half. But I gotta say, it was one of the more engaging parts of the movie, not just with the mutant powers and the rest of the action being done, but overall in just how much more entertained I was with this movie. On that note, I will say that I was fairly entertained by this movie overall, and I didn't think it was the total disaster that many were predicting it to be or have already said it is upon seeing it. But even with all of that, I do agree that it is disappointing at best and mediocre at best when looking at all of the things considered for what this movie did in being the final entry in the core X-Men film series. When looking at this as a whole, the way it just all felt rushed together, inconsequential, and not really feeling like the grand finale that we all deserved, it either should have been split up into two movies, as the good folks over at doubletoasted.com have said, or have had one more movie before this one occur leading into the Dark Phoenix saga, instead of just feeling so smashed together and coming so directly after Apocalypse, which I found myself enjoying more than I was with watching Dark Phoenix, which is saying something there. But also, when looking at the franchise as a whole, while I don't think it is horrible, and it's certainly far from strong, it is the weakest X-Men film that we have gotten in a decade, which, if you look back, a decade ago, we got X-Men Origins Wolverine. It is a shame that this franchise had to end this way before we get to see what's to come with these characters eventually in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And speaking of that, it goes about saying that Avengers Endgame over a month ago ended its era of films for certain characters and storylines with how it all came together in an epic 3-hour extravaganza, and the way that Dark Phoenix came together in just under 2 hours and ending on a whimper. Yeah, it is really a letdown to say how this movie did turn out as a whole. I will say, though, that the final moment of the movie involving two core characters did bring back the spirit of the film, if briefly, and calling back to the very beginning of this franchise for how it really did strike a chord with so many fans, including myself. Longtime fans of the series will go into this film to make up their own minds and how they make of this series ending as a whole. If you're not one of those longtime or diehard fans of this series and you're looking for your superhero or comic book fix, I recommend seeing Avengers Endgame way more than this. Or if you're in the mood for X-Men, might I suggest watching my 3 favorite X-Men films, those being First Class, Days of Future Past, and Logan. As for me, though, in wrapping up this review, I don't think this is the worst in the X-Men franchise, and I have seen worse in the comic book / superhero genre, but the way it all came together did make for a mediocre finale to this iconic film franchise. I hope that these characters do come back later on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, bigger and better, but I will still not forget the legacy that these X-Men films have had. My final verdict for Dark Phoenix is 2.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Dark Phoenix, social media links in the description, subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.